Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist.
If you had 1 minute to be able to unpack for the audience,
we interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
Well, I personally believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the authors of those books that we call the Gospels. Suppose they weren't, to use Ehrman's argument. Would that crush our scriptures as Christians?
No, not at all. It would certainly, we couldn't have the kind of confidence exactly like we have now if you look at and say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because Matthew and John would have been 2 of the 12 apostles, and then Mark and Luke would have been those who got their information from the eyewitnesses, the apostles. So that's a traditional authorship. If the traditional authorship is mistaken, that doesn't mean we throw out the Gospels and call them unreliable. There's still a number of reasons that would lead us to believe that the Gospels do contain trustworthy material in it, though we couldn't say it would all be completely trustworthy. For example, there are a number of things that can be corroborated by non-Christian sources of the period, like Josephus and Tacitus, Marbach, Serapion, and Lucian. You can build a basic outline for the life of Jesus based on those non-Christian writings of the period. You can also look and say, we can identify multiple independent sources even within the Gospels. And this is the kind of things that professional historians outside the guild of biblical scholars would look at within their writings, because there are certain ancient writings that we really don't know who wrote those either, but yet they don't become completely unsalvageable to us because we don't know the author for certain. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul preserves an early tradition of Jesus on what Jesus said at the Last Supper. When you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John on what Jesus said at the Last Supper, and you read Luke especially, you find that what Luke reports is almost word for what Paul reported. But Paul is writing a few decades before Luke wrote. So Paul is preserving some oral tradition, Jesus tradition, that's very early. We can identify that in Paul. Now, when you read the same sort of tradition about what Jesus said at the Last Supper in Matthew and Mark, it's a little different. The gist is the same, but the words are different. So we have two independent sources here. So when we have that gives us confidence that the tradition being preserved is authentic. And there are other things involved that we can go back and identify. We can show that Paul was teaching with the essentials what the apostles were teaching. And so when we go to Paul's letters, at least those that we're certain Paul wrote, and identify certain core or essential doctrines, then we know this is representative of apostolic teaching as well. And when those reflect what's in the Gospels, that's multiple independent sources there. So that's just a few things. There are other things that would lead us to believe that and can identify eyewitness testimony within the Gospels. So even if they weren't written by the traditional sources, I do believe they are, but even if they weren't, that doesn't mean we throw them out. There's still a lot we can know about Jesus with some pretty good certainty.
That's helpful. Thanks for those tips.